sometimes the fact that both sides of politics agree on something doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good thing. And my classic example of this is the moment there's a bipartisan agreement that the rate of immigration, which was already at an extremely high level under the Howard government and under the Hawke-Keating government. It was, check the figures in my book, and we had the fastest pace of immigration of any developed country, any OECD country, with the exception of Israel, because it had a massive influx of people from the former Soviet Union, if you look over the past 25 years, over that 25-year period. So we had a very rapid pace, and then starting late in the Howard government, especially ramped up during the Rudd government, we doubled that pace. And that's created a whole lot of ramifications in terms of weak wages growth, because there's been a massive influx of additional people into the huge addition to supply in the labour market. It's added hugely to housing prices. So it's having all sorts of implications, and yet both sides of politics remain strongly committed to this for reasons that I don't think reflect the national interest, but reflect cold political calculations of particular factions of those parties. So I put that word of caution in. Having said which, it is true that there are various, there are lots of things where there could perfectly happily be sensible debate about things, and sometimes we have arguments when it's entirely unnecessary. You have arguments for the sake of having arguments, and again, to give a good example from recent times, the Labor Party has a very proud history on pension reform, actually. It was the Keating government that started, in terms of altering the age pension to reflect the fact that life expectancy has risen so dramatically. So when the age pension was introduced, it was set at access at age 65 for men, at a time when I think the average life expectancy was about 59, something, it was below 60. And that age never changed, even as the average life expectancy of men rose into the 80s. And that's not a sustainable thing. You can't go on and on to the point where a huger and huger proportion of people's lives are eligible for the pension. So the Keating government actually introduced reforms, first of all, to align the female pension age with the male pension age. And the Rudd government, to give it credit, I'm critical of many things about the Rudd government, but the Rudd government introduced an important reform in 2009 to raise the pension age from 65 to 67. And that was supported by the coalition at the time. But then when the Abbott government in the 2014-15 budget made a proposal to just continue the same gradual increase that the Rudd government had prescribed, to gradually continue that to age 70 by the mid-2030s. Now, it's fine to argue maybe 70 is too far or whatever. You could have had a good debate, to your point, a good debate about what exactly is the right thing to do. Maybe we should stop at 69, whatever. But instead, actually, the Labor Party's position, they just decided to have a big argument about that because it was politically advantageous at the time. And so instead of getting a further good reform, even a compromise one, we had a silly debate which was completely contrary to the principles that the Labor Party had pursued and greatly to its credit had pursued for the previous 20 years. So it would be great if on some of these issues where there is bipartisan appreciation of a problem, you could just have a sensible debate about how best to solve it rather than turning it into a political football.
But to have a good debate, you need a lot of information. Now, just to unpack for a moment, there'll be a lot of interest, I would think, in what you have to say about immigration, because a lot of people are talking about it and what it means. My understanding is that there's probably a lot of legitimacy to the view that our GDP growth has really been held at quite high levels, no recession for a long time, because of that growth. But what it's disguising is that per person GDP has been static or slipping. In other words, people in the community feel that because their wages are not rising. They've been flatlining while asset prices have been going through the roof, i.e. your houses. I think when I left school, I've got a fair bit of grey hair, in the mid-70s, the cost of an average Australian house worked out at around 4 times annual average earnings, whereas now it's 11 or 12 and more in Sydney and Melbourne. That's a startling rise over my lifetime. It means my children have a completely different set of opportunities in terms of a roof over their head to what I was fortunate enough to enjoy, and I thought it was expensive enough at the time. But these, unpacking these conundrums, so high immigration makes GDP growth look stronger than it feels per individual in the community, and they're probably right?
Well, they are right. In fact, the data show that under the Howard government, GDP per person rose at almost 2.5% a year, which admittedly is a very rapid pace. Normally, that was an extremely good general outcome. But for the corresponding period since then, the dozen years since the Howard government, it's risen at 0.9%. So that's well less than half the pace. And that's what matters to people. After all, it doesn't matter to the Australian people to prop up a measured growth figure by jamming more people in. The analogy I think of is, imagine if Australia were to annex New Zealand tomorrow. Well, we'd end up with a much better rugby team, which would probably be helpful. But no one, you would hope no one would be so ridiculous to say, oh, that's a great thing because our economy grew by 15% this quarter. And yet that would be 15%, whatever the appropriate figure would be. It's roughly that. No one would be saying, isn't it fantastic, what a great growth outcome. And yet, in a sense, that's actually what we've been doing, albeit slightly more slowly, over the past dozen years, even for a time before that. Over the past dozen years, we've taken in about 2 Adelaide's worth of population. We've taken in, if we keep the same pace of immigration going for another 7 or 8 years, we will effectively, in the space of 2 decades, have taken in an entire New Zealand population in the space of just 2 decades. An entire New Zealand population just in new immigrants, leave aside the new children that are then born to those immigrants and so forth. So that's fine. That may or may not be a good thing. You can argue about all the pros and cons in terms of all the cultural, social, economic, other implications, but you should never say it's a good thing just because measured GDP has been increased as a result of that. And so, yeah, we should be focusing on what are the actual outcomes for people, what are their outcomes in terms of their wages growth, which is a proxy for their living standards, which is the GDP per capita figures that I was mentioning before. What's happened, what are the implications for housing markets, housing prices, the capacity of people to get into the, to get in to the market, be able to start a family. Again, one of the reasons that's often advanced for why we need this extraordinarily rapid immigration program is to prevent ageing of the population, because immigrants tend to be, on average, our immigration program is skewed to be people typically in their 20s and 30s, and so they are younger than the average of the population. That is helpful in the short term, but it's not helpful in the long term because they themselves age, and unless in a Ponzi-like way, you keep ratcheting up the size of the immigration program, you end up almost no different in terms of your aging on a 50 or 100-year horizon. So you need to think carefully through the actual implications, and that's what I try to do in my book, and actually understand all these linkages between the demography, the issues, the economic implications for struggling families in terms of housing and wages and so forth.
Thank you for watching this episode. We appreciate your support. If you value vital conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the channel there and also click the notification bell to stay up to date with new releases.